My interest in gender probably started even before I became a corporate executive. I think I've had a few defining moments in my life around gender. The first one happened, I grew up in a small town hotel, and my father, in those days, this was the 60s, there used to be travelers that went up and down the road to everybody's. They would stay one night in our hotel and see all of the businesses in the surrounding area. And then they might travel a few hours up the road where they would stay in another hotel and see all the businesses around there. So we got to know the regulars who came every Monday, every Tuesday, every Wednesday. And one day my father was behind the desk checking a man in, and I recognized the man and I knew which room he liked to stay in. So I ran and got that key. Well, first of all, I put the card in front of him to fill out. Then I ran and got his key. And then I knew that my father needed to take his money. So I ran and got the cash box, one of those gray tin boxes that you open up. And my father kind of made a joke and said, well, I guess I'm not even really needed around here anymore. And this guy said, that girl has so much gumption, you could put her out in the alley and she could fend for herself. I wish my son was that independent and self-sufficient. And I saw my father puff up in pride, and I thought to myself, okay, it's a good thing to be independent and self-sufficient and have gumption. And it's a good thing if you're a girl to be compared to a boy. So that, I think, made me realize I was probably already that way, but I developed more of what you would typically call masculine characteristics. And then I went to work in a fertilizer company, and I was the only woman in the management team. The only other women were in the secretarial pool. And I noticed that when we were in meetings, when we were making corporate decisions, that there were ways that those guys that I worked with expected me to act because I was a woman. And I also noticed that they would come into my office and they would speak with a lot of heart about their children and their aspirations as parents. And then I would go into the boardroom and I would watch these same guys, and suddenly they would kind of puff themselves up, and they would be more masculine than the guy next to them, and they'd start pounding the table and saying, we're going to snuff out the competition. And I realized that they were wanting to be more masculine when they were with other men, and that the way that they did that was to be as far away from the feminine as possible. And it just made me really interested in the study of how men are expected to act and how they do tune themselves like musical instruments when they're around other men, and women, how they expect women to act. And I realized that that creates two different kinds of management. We expect men to be strong and independent and self-sufficient and bottom line oriented and more courageous risk takers when they are leaders. And for women, we expect them to be kind and caring and nurturing and supportive and collaborative and consensual when they are leaders. In short, we think that men should take charge and women should take care. And you know, that means that none of us are performing as individuals. And I really believe that each and every one of us was put on earth for a reason. And we all have our own gifts and talents, and we need to be bringing those forth into the world. And when we're stifling who we really are to fit into a gender box, we're robbing not only ourselves, but the world of our gifts and talents.
So when you were in that environment, in this very corporate environment, and you were the only woman on this team at this level, when you were ascending, how did that process happen? And like, how did people take you seriously? Like, how did you develop those kind of relationships where people were taking you seriously enough to want you to like actually climb the ladder?
Well, I think I had to, first of all, display a lot of masculine attributes myself, because in our society right now, we tend to think that the attributes of the masculine are interchangeable with the attributes of leadership. So for any woman who is wanting to be perceived as a leader, they need to display the attributes of the masculine. In fact, there's lots of studies around that. Stanford Business School followed 132 of their female graduates over 6 years. And what they found is the women who displayed the attributes of the masculine got promoted more. But they also had to make sure that, as well as showing the attributes of the masculine, they had to cloak that with showing the attributes of the feminine as well, because we believe that women should act a certain way. And in order for those women to be liked and appreciated, they had to show the attributes of the masculine to be perceived as a leader, and the attributes of the feminine in order to progress, because then that's how people like them. And I think I became an expert at using both. And that made me start to realize how important it is for all of us to use both. And we can, and we need to, no matter what career we're in. Even as a mother, there are times when we need to exhibit the attributes of the masculine and take strong stands on things and institute boundaries. And then there are also times when we need to stop and really listen and understand how someone else is feeling. And this is for men and for women. And when we can do that, then I believe we really have what I wrote about in my book, and that is gender physics, the ability to move back and forth between the attributes of both, using them both in the right circumstances, with the right people, and in the right environment. And that's where I think ultimately you get success. So your original question was, how did I actually ascend? I showed the attributes of the feminine to be liked and the attributes of the masculine to be considered a leader. And that meant that people took note of me, gave me more responsibility, and ultimately gave me a better title and ultimately more pay.
So when you were in that environment, and you mentioned that at that time, the other women were in the secretarial pool, how in the beginning were you treated by other women? And then, like, was there some kind of wall or like feeling of division? And like, if there was that type of conflict, how did you, because you say like you present aspects of the feminine as well to be liked. So it's like, how did you kind of navigate that and feel like you were allowed to have that, like, do that dance?
Well, I think because women are expected to be good relationship builders, it was really important for me to build good relationships with the women in the secretarial pool. And it was easy because I genuinely did like them and had a lot in common with them. And in fact, at one point, I shared a secretary with another guy, and she had small children, and this was before I had children. And once I got pregnant, I was turning to her for advice all the time. And we used to make jokes, and she used to say, well, Betty Ann is mentoring me to be a better corporate executive, and I'm mentoring her on how to be a mother. And so, you know, you form those relationships. I really noticed it. Sometimes there'd be a number of women in the secretarial pool who were working on a project with us. And the guys could walk by and just throw something on their desk and say, I need this by 2 o'clock. And that was acceptable to those women. But I couldn't do that, or they'd think that I was, you know, the B word. And so I found that I would always stop and chat and sort of say, you know, how was Johnny's soccer game last night? And oh, if he lost, how did he feel about it? Or boy, they've been doing really well. Something that kind of showed them that I cared about them. And then I'd say, you know, I'm sorry to ask this because I know you're busy, but I need it by 2 o'clock. And then it was like, no problem. So it meant that as women, we do need to form those relationships because people expect us to be likable and relationship builders. And if we're not, they think that we're just too aggressive, and they don't like us and don't give us opportunities.
So moving into how did you transition away from that position? And then how did you come to write your book?
Well, it kind of evolved. I left my corporate position, and as soon as I did, because I felt like I wanted to do something more, just something different. I felt like I've done as much as I'm going to do in this corporation. I've enjoyed it. It's been fun, but I'm a lifelong learner and I need to keep learning and I need to go out there and do something different. And so I immediately was invited to give speeches at, when I retired, I was young enough that I guess people felt I was still current. And I was invited to give speeches, and I started giving speeches to women's groups and about how to climb the corporate ladder. And so I started doing a lot more research on gender in order to talk about the way that men are likely to react to women's communication styles and, all the sort of areas that we bump into as women working in environments with a lot of men, or trying to make it in a man's world, if you will. And so I found that I was giving a lot of speeches. I started reading a lot about, so what I found is that as I started giving more, I started becoming more interested, and I started speaking more on gender and thinking back throughout my career on all the differences in the way that I had been treated. And, and I remember one of the guys that I worked with was our CFO. His undergraduate degree was in biology. And he used to say, Betty Ann, how men have the XY chromosome and women have the XX chromosome? I said, yes. Well, the bottom half of your last X has fallen off, and it's looking an awful lot like a Y. What he was really saying is, there's a lot of man in your woman. You're reacting right now the way I would expect a man to react. And so we have these expectations, and I started reading about it, thinking more about it, started speaking about it. And eventually I came to the conclusion that we all need to use the attributes of both. And so I thought, we need masculine energy, we need feminine energy, and we all have that in us. And we need to use both. Well, then I started finding that was sort of a topic of the times. I started finding a lot of new research was coming out. So for example, the University of Tel Aviv put 1,400 men and women through an MRI. And the MRI showed that they looked at their brains, and it showed that those brains that we used to think were masculine or feminine at one end of the spectrum or the other were fewer than 1%. And that each and every one of us has a brain that is made up of a myriad of characteristics. And those characteristics are not flagged as masculine or feminine. So in the same way that we have, all of us, fingerprints that are truly our own, and the iris of our eye that is truly our own, and neither of those things are flagged as masculine or feminine, it's the same with our brains. So there's no reason why we should be acting a certain way because of our sex. This is all, gender is a social construct. It's something that's taught to us from the time we're born. And I just found so much research that I found so interesting that eventually I started sharing it with people in speeches, and I decided to put it all in a book. And it took me a long time to write the book, because I started off writing it for women, because that's mainly who I was speaking to. And then I went out one night with a friend of my daughter's who is involved in an organization called Man Talks, where men actually get together and discuss why does masculine is supposed to look this way, and why. And he said to me, I want to hear about your book. When I told him I'd written it for women, he said, oh no, you have to write it for men too. I'm a man, we need this information. So then I went back when I thought my book was all finished, and I spent another year working on it, taking every one of my concepts and putting in the man's point of view. So it really is now a business book tells a lot of my own business stories and shows what it's like from the masculine point of view and what it's like from the feminine point of view.
What can you say? Because I find that sometimes when you're talking about the attributes of leadership, and that it's just a reality that people respond to the masculine energy a little bit better when people are in leadership positions, or when they want to be in leadership positions. So I've heard pushback in general conversation and media from women who are a little bit resentful, where it's well, why do I have to act like a man, or why do I have to think like a man? Why can't I be the way that I am and be taken seriously? When you get that kind of pushback, when you're speaking or when you're you encounter this type of response or feeling where it makes sense, and at the same time, like we have to be like we have to come to that place between idealism and reality. Like, how do you respond when someone feels that way?
Well, first of all, I completely agree, because ultimately what I want is for everyone to express themselves as an individual. And that may mean that, so for example, maybe you're more introverted. So that means that you're a better listener. We tend to think that men should talk and express themselves and get the idea out there, and women should listen. And in fact, the research shows that little girls at school are rewarded for sitting quietly, while teachers spend 2/3 of their time encouraging little boys to think more deeply and speak about subjects. So we've been trained to be good listeners, but you might be introverted by nature. Well, just because you're introverted doesn't mean that you're not, if you feel passionate about something, you're going to step outside your shell, your introversion, and you're going to express yourself strongly. So what I say is that we all have all of these attributes in us, and it's our job to accept them and to allow them to emerge and work together. And the problem is that we call them masculine and we call them feminine. And it's kind of counterintuitive, because I wrote this book saying, here's all the masculine attributes and here's all the feminine attributes. And I didn't assign those attributes. I'm just going with, if I go into a room and teach a workshop and I put all these attributes up on the board and I say, okay, aggression, is that masculine or feminine? Everybody in that room is going to say that's masculine, that kind of thing. So I'm not saying this is masculine, this is feminine. I'm just going with popular culture. But what I'm really saying is, ultimately, I would like for us to say, this is just assertive and this is just accommodating. And it doesn't matter. That's not masculine or feminine. It's just two different attributes that each of us can use, depending on the situation, the person, the environment. And so I'd like to get rid of those words masculine and feminine. And so it's kind of counterintuitive. I don't want to say you have to act like a man. And in fact, part of the problem is all of these attributes are strengths when they're used in the proper amount and they're not overused. But when they're dialed up to the extreme, that's when they become problematic. So you could be you can be directive and give people good direction. But as soon as you start being domineering, you've dialed it up to the extreme, and that's when it becomes problematic. And too often we go from saying, okay, I need to insert more masculine, and then we start becoming aggressive as opposed to just being directive. And so we really need to be careful not to overuse any of those attributes. And so often when people are saying, I don't want to have to act like a man, they're thinking about the over dialed up version of men.
Yeah. So on the flip side, when you're working with teams or when you're talking to people where there's kind of a feeling, like when I was in consulting, there were no women from like the manager level, director to executive. There was no women in this particular company. It was very, very like traditional environment. And so when I was included in like private meetings or whatever, there was like a lot of kind of conflict that ended up like manifesting in the office. So when that happens, where there's a team of men and they don't want women included, like they don't want women in the boardroom, or if a woman is in the boardroom, they're treated like, okay, go get the coffee or something like that. If you're working with these type of teams where maybe there is like one pocket of the company, there's like this little clique and they don't want like women coming in, they don't want to work with women, or they don't want that experience of like having to connect or trying to like be a little bit more open, how do you respond in those situations?
Well, first of all, I think you have to show people the research that shows that diverse teams get far better results because they actually have more input. As soon as you have people that are all like-minded, you get into groupthink, and then people just quickly make a decision and move on into something without looking at all the potential problems that could come up and looking at all the ways that they could benefit the most. And so those teams usually, a system that's out of balance always fails. And so the first thing that I always tell people is if you're not willing to have diversity, you're setting yourself up for failure because it is always out of balance and it always falls over. So the first thing that you have to do is open people up and realize, help people spend time seeing the views of the other. So in other words, if somebody says, you know, I don't think we should be doing it that way because, have them take the other position and argue from the other point of view. It's a very simple, it's been used in debates for years where people just take the opposite position. But once people take the opposite position, they can usually see that there's advantages to that as well. So first of all, I would say if it's really a system that's too far over I actually find when I go out and talk, I find that men are really very open to all of this. And most of them really want to learn to be better leaders. So I find that they will come in and they will say things like, tell me how to develop more empathy. I know I need more empathy. Tell me how to do that. So I actually find that they are, and I will also say that they're open to it. And I will also say that as a woman, if you're in that position where they just want you to get coffee, a lot of the times they're just not thinking. These guys are coming to the office, they're busy, they've got problems at work, they're trying to sort through these problems, and they'll be kind of like, you know, get coffee without stopping to realize. And I used to just make jokes. And so as soon as you kind of make a joke, people kind of step back and it causes them to stop. And then they'll go, yeah, you're right. I don't need to be saying that. So I remember we used to sit down in meetings and everybody would have coffee. All the guys would get up and leave the meeting and they'd leave all the coffee cups on the boardroom table. And I think to myself, so I'm friends with all these women in the secretarial pool. They're going to have to come and clean up these coffee cups. They're busy with all these jobs that have been dropped off that they need to be done by 2 o'clock. This isn't fair to them. So before the guys would leave the meeting, I'd say, okay, guys, I'm a woman, doesn't mean I have a biological need to clean up. Everybody's got to clean up before we leave here. So everybody would kind of laugh at that. It'd be a chuckle. And then but it would be enough to get people to do it without me being overly directive. I could do it in a nice way. So humor is huge in helping break through any stereotypes.
Yeah. So, okay. So during the Me Too, movement, I was at this, workshop at a fintech company, and this female executive was like, I think she was the only female executive at the company, and she was very beautiful, and she was like maybe in her 40s or 50s. And so I noticed that during the workshop, the Me Too stuff wasn't addressed. None of that was addressed. They addressed fashion and they addressed all this other stuff. And then so afterwards, I went up to her and I was like, I'm guessing throughout your career, I'm guessing lots of people have come on to you. Lots of people have put you in a strange position. And I just asked her, how do you deal with it? How have you dealt with that so that you could be at this level in such a often masculine environment? And she was just like, oh, I just make a joke. If someone comes on to me, I'll just make a joke. And then if they're persistent, I'll say this is a professional setting and private and professional is separate. And then she was like, but you have to close with something soft so that they don't feel rejected, or else then there'll be an issue and that the bullying could get worse or whatever it is. So I just how do you address that kind of stuff? Where there, when it comes to Me Too stuff, and then in workshops where it's it was all women in this workshop and that topic was still avoided, where it's such a big deal. so many people have to like go through that, where they have to figure out how to deal with it themselves. And when it comes to like using humor, or using like having to soften like the rejection or whatever it is, it's like, how would you like help a woman not just like not feel resentful of like having to do that like so often, but also where it's like, well, why do I have to think about that instead of like my work? Like, why do I have to then think about, you know, how to make this person feel better, and like how to like, you know, make sure that tomorrow they're still gonna like be okay around me. Like, how do you kind of walk through, like, if a woman talks about that, and what, like, why do you think we're still like avoiding it in like workshop settings, like even when it's groups of women? Why do you feel like we're still kind of, you know, not
Yes.
comfortable?
So I have a mentorship program for women at the University of Saskatchewan, and it always comes up. Me Too stuff always comes up, and I encourage women to talk about it, because I think we need to. The problem was it was swept under the carpet for so many years, and it's important that we talk about it. And so it's not just the fact, you know, it's not just using humor and, you know, but also I think you have to spend some time, sometimes actually standing up for yourself in a more overt manner, where you speak directly to someone and say, I'd like a meeting in your office, and say, you know, that behavior really wasn't appropriate, and you need teams, most successful teams. You want to be successful in this job, and you will be successful if you have women, but if you treat women that way, they're going to leave. And I don't want to leave, and you don't want me to leave. I'm valuable. You need me. And I'm willing to put it behind us and move forward, but we have to do that. And this has to stop. Ultimately, I have done a lot of mentoring of women who've been in these positions, and I've talked to them about taking it to HR and how they go about doing that in order to make it so that they are not damaging their career or putting themselves in a bad position. One of the things that I think women, if you work in a culture that is really, that's very sort of endemic in the culture, you probably you want to leave. And ultimately, those companies, if you go to HR, you can go to them and say, look, you're going to lose a lot of women, because this is the way women are being treated here. It's part of the culture, and you've got some work to do as an organization to try to change that culture. And I'm willing to stay around and help you change it, but I'm not willing to stay around if you're not going to change it. I'm not going to let it be swept under the carpet. And then I think in every organization, you will find that there are good men, and we need to enlist the help of those good men and allyship. So you need to find men who'll be your allies. And, you know, these are men that haven't been in your position, so they don't realize how it feels. But mostly I found that the best allies were those that had women that were trying to make it in the outside business world, or they had daughters. And if you could go to them and say, you know, here's what I'm experiencing. I need your help. I need your advice. Sometimes they will even go and talk to somebody on their own without you having to be involved, and say, look, you got to knock this off. We don't want to lose her. And we will if this carries on. So developing male allies is really important. And they are in every organization. And when I go out and speak, I'm always talking to managers and saying, your success is based on keeping women in your organization. Because I can tell you, I've been on a board where we did a CEO search committee, and I just looked at all of the headhunting firms that put forward their applications, and any that didn't have women in senior positions, I just took them off the table immediately. So those companies that aren't keeping women, there's getting to be enough women in senior positions that are paying attention and are noticing and want to. So we're, you know, I'd like to be able to say I can totally change the system for you, and here's the key, and I don't have that. But I do really believe that if we can keep women in the system and keep them moving up, that they will then do the kinds of things such as saying, we're not doing business with you because you don't have enough women. And that means those companies have to go back and look at themselves.
Wow. And do you have like guidance around like, because this is another topic that I find avoided a lot, where women like having a hard time getting along with women. And so, for example, like when I was working in live events and broadcasting, and I was sexually assaulted, like this guy like grabbed my butt who'd been at the company for like 30 years. And I told him like, get your hand off my butt. And he just like grabbed it more. And when I went to my manager, who was a female, she just said, oh, it's your fault because like you're too like nice to everyone. And it's strange because it's live events. So like you kind of have to talk to everyone and be really warm and friendly. And so then I had to like go to the higher office um and I actually didn't agree with how they dealt with it because they demanded an apology from the male and the female. And because the female wouldn't apologize, they fired her. And they kept the guy who did the assault. And even though I felt like, obviously I was upset, like that she said it was my fault or whatever, but I actually didn't think that two women should be wronged for the action of one man kind of thing. So like, I was just surprised at like how the company handled it. And then also, not knowing, because I was much younger, this was years ago, so like not knowing how to navigate like that experience with women, where there's like, even if we try to have like feminine presentation, where like we're being more caring or more warm or like showing more interest in people, sometimes there still is that like kind of conflict with women. Obviously there's conflict between men and there's conflict between men and women. It's just personality types too. Like people have different personalities, and like guys are like always competing with each other and like, you know, kind of cutting each other down, and you know, but when like with women, it can become where they can't work together. Like I find, like I remember reading something about, you know, because male like sports are encouraged, and like because men like went off to war and like went off hunting, like even when they don't like each other, like they might still get like work done, whereas like women have the tendency to kind of like, when they don't like each other, to ostracize. I don't know, like I don't know if this is like totally current, and I don't know like if the data is like current or what I'm saying, but I just remember reading like articles about this. So when women are feeling that way, like in school or in an office or in a certain like industry, how do you suggest like moving through where you feel like you're being ostracized, or you feel like, you know, like there's something happening where even if you present yourself in a feminine way, like there's still like conflict there and separation, as opposed to like, okay, we don't like each other, but let's get this done, you know?
So again, back to our socialization, which again creates these attributes of the masculine and attributes of the feminine. The men are, as you mentioned earlier, they go to war, they play sports. It's very hierarchical. So they have learned from a very young age that there's a coach, a captain, first string, second string, third string, and they all feed up and support the person at the top of the hierarchy. They're used to that. Women are trained to be more collective, and it's all about the group. And so they have learned by playing dolls, and everybody brings their doll to the doll house, and they're all together, and they all decide collectively, what are our dolls going to do today? Well, they're going to go to a ball. Okay, everybody then knows how to dress their doll. And so women have this attribute that you're part of the same group. And in Australia, they have a sort of a saying called the tall poppy syndrome, which is the tall poppy that grows above the other is the one that gets cut off. And so women tend, if somebody rises, men expect somebody to rise above the group, and they support that person based on their socialization. This is, again, I want to emphasize, not based on their innate characteristics, but based on the way they've been trained. Women want everybody to be at the same level. And when somebody rises above, they tend to cut them off. And again, this is socialization. So There's a few problems. One of the problems is that women get into organizations and they start working and they realize that as you start climbing that ladder, there are fewer and fewer positions for women, and there's usually only a token woman. So every woman becomes competition for that position. And so they tend to pull other women down. That's part of it. Part of it also is that they see a patriarchal system that's been designed by men for men, and they can see that it's going to be difficult to navigate that system. So they tend to fold themselves into a man and make his success their success. And that means that they are then suspicious of any other woman that might make inroads with that man that they've attached themselves to. And this is not necessarily a love relationship. This is just my way of getting ahead. So every other woman becomes competition. So it's difficult to break down that, because I will say that I belong to a number of organizations with women where the women work really well together and enjoy each other and get a lot of work done together. But we have to get past a lot of these old ideas and see ourselves as powerful individuals that don't need a man and are not afraid to see another woman rise up and support that woman.
So how did you like, how is your process for writing this book? And then what has been the aftermath?
Well, I started by writing a lot of my stories. I divided all the attributes that I would typically think of as masculine and typically think of as feminine into groups. And then I came up with stories that reinforced or gave as examples how those played out in my work life and what I could have done to be in better balance, and where I maybe at some points used too much masculine or too much feminine, and how that was to my personal detriment. So I found that I wrote all this out. Then I started doing a lot of research, and then I decided, if I want this to be really valuable for women or for the readers, because it ultimately ended up being both, and I have actually done a lot of work with men around this, I need to have something a little more concrete, some exercises that they can do, so that it's not just here's the theory, but here's some exercises you can do. So then I spent time coming up with some exercises and trying them with people. And then I came up with a questionnaire so that I could have people take a questionnaire and decide, is my natural go-to energy masculine or feminine? So I'm naturally more masculine in the way that I present myself in the world. And there are men, many of whom might be elementary school teachers, that are more feminine in the way that they present themselves to the world, because they're more nurturing and helping develop those little children. So what I tried to do, I thought a lot about whether I wanted to call it masculine and feminine for all the reasons we've just talked about. And I thought, should I call it hard power, soft power? And ultimately I thought, we need to hold up the mirror and recognize that we have these ideas about the way that men should act, and these ideas about the way that women should act. And if we don't have the conversation, we can't bring that idea from our subconscious to our conscious and make a different decision and then allow it to be repackaged to go back down to our subconscious again. So that's my ultimate goal.
And when you receive like pushback that, I mean, this is a little bit more controversial, but it feels like more religious. So like, what I remember going to there was this church downtown that was like all these young people like had started this church, and it was growing really fast. And so I went for about 6 months, and something that I noticed that was so consistent was when I think it was a pastor, when the pastor was thanking a couple, he would always thank the man for their contribution, and then the wife for supporting her husband, like over and over again. And they were young, like these were young people, like this was a young couple that started this church, like young family, and they were from Australia, like super, like, lots of, I guess, open-mindedness. But then when I would help with events, like I would see over and over again that the leadership was male and that the wives were very kind of like in the background, and that this thanking like process would continue, like where it was thanking the man and then thanking his wife for supporting him. And then so like whatever they did for the church, it was always like the husband that was acknowledged for it. So if there is pushback, not just from traditional standpoints or like from possibly religious or spiritual standpoints, but when it feels like that, where it's a little bit like it becomes challenging to talk about gender physics, how do you move through like situations like that? Or how would you address it with people who might think that talking about gender physics is not respecting like a conservative, traditional family oriented standpoint?
Well, I mean, it is interesting because if you think about religion, from the time that we're young and we go to church, we're praying to somebody at the top of the hierarchy, and that person at the top of the hierarchy is male. So, for example, when I was raising my children, we always prayed to Father, Mother, God. So we always prayed to somebody that was masculine and feminine. So the church is conservative, and so they are going to tend to have the hierarchical, the man and the woman supports them. I do think that in spirituality, when people are praying and they are accepting others as themselves, that's the ultimate kind in connecting with God. So I think it's important to have that relationship with God that is outside of boundaries established in a more traditional world. So what I would be looking for is a lot more egalitarian relationships between a man and a woman. And so you would want a man that accepts a woman to be an equal, and a woman who then doesn't have expectations that a man is going to support her. So that it becomes something you do equally, that you both have careers and you decide things together. And so ultimately, it is really all about having the openness to have the conversations and to be open to listening to others as opposed to trying to convince them about your point of view.
Now that people have access to your book and people are doing the exercises and stuff, what has that been like? And like, what has the feedback been like? And what has that kind of experience like, how does it change the feeling about the book from writing it to like experiencing like other people experiencing it?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, when you write a book, I'm an extrovert by nature. So for me to sit down in front of a computer and write all day, type, and I don't even know how to type, so finger type. It was a lot of work for me because I tend to feed off other people. As an extrovert, I want to give an idea, hear an idea, share an idea, and that's energizing for me. And when I got really into, I've got to get this book done, I would get up in the morning and I would be in my robe, eating dry cereal out of the box, typing away and thinking, this is so interesting. And then the next minute I'd think, I'm wasting my life. No one's ever going to read this. So you kind of go from, oh, I'm really enjoying this to, why am I doing this? But I will tell you that it is very gratifying when people find you that just out of the blue. Like I have a woman from the States who found my book, read it. She has a large mortgage brokerage company. She has introduced me to a lot of women in her company and had me do, bought books for them, had me do online mentorship things like we're doing right now. Another woman who works up north that got a whole bunch of women that are in the mining industry together to read the book, to ask questions, and for them to kind of zero in on it and say, this makes sense to me, is very gratifying. And I taught a workshop once, and there was a woman in the workshop who'd been in a previous workshop. And I know that it's a lot to grasp the whole idea because it's just so far outside of the way we've been trained and how we accept our world to work. And she just said, for everybody that's on this call, I want you to know that when I first heard this, I thought it was crazy, but I started using it and it works. So I would really encourage you, because I think you're going to get more gratification out of your job by trying these techniques. Well, that just made me feel like this is part of my mission on the world. Like, I think that we are evolving as a society away from these very pillared, polarized ideals of a woman has to be this way and a man has to be this way. And we're moving towards people being who they are and expressing themselves. And I just feel like I have a little tiny part to do in that, and I'm doing my part. But there's lots of people all over the world that are writing and talking about this kind of thing, and it does my heart good.
When people, like, I remember, I don't know if I read it somewhere or if I heard it, but they were saying that, like, there was some study done that shows that men are better at having a vision. And I, like, in my personal experience, when I ask women about, like, okay, what their goals are, what their vision is for a year, for 5 years, for 10 years, like, the vast majority of people that I've spoken to have a vision. Like, women, like, have a vision. And I don't know what this I don't know how they did the study. I need to research it more, but when that idea, like, because I'm an entrepreneur, so I found, like, in my own experience, that no matter what my idea is, no matter what my vision is, no matter, like, how much I get the ball rolling on something, the people that are willing to, like, be part of it are very, very, very few and far in between. Like, it's like, it doesn't matter how good something is, it doesn't matter, like, what meeting I land, it's like, people are like, no, you have to, basically, I feel like, in order to be taken seriously, like, I have to already, like, have some, like, huge following, or, like, have some multi-million-dollar deal for, like, people to actually come in. Like, when I hear stories of, like, Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates, it's like their friends are just, like, willing to, like, be in at the beginning. So, and family and things like that. So it's like, when women have, like, they have vision, and when I talk to women, they have a vision, but it's just not taken seriously. How do you, like, I don't know, did you see that study that says, like, that men are better at vision than women or something? It's like, how, if that's what people actually think, like, and that's how people respond, where if a guy has an idea, it's like, it's just taken more seriously at the beginning or something. And how, like, for women, where they might have ideas and they might work on them, they might be, like, growing, but it takes so much longer for someone to, like, take it seriously. How would you encourage women to, like, keep, like, staying focused and staying on top of it, where they might not be getting, like, the feedback that, like, a male counterpart might be getting throughout the process?
Well, I think, again, we're going back to gender stereotypes, because if you think about it, if you're a woman and you've been in a meeting with a number of men, every woman has had this experience, and every man doesn't believe that it's true, or can't quite believe it when they hear it. But if a woman is in a meeting and she gives a suggestion, she's very used to it being glossed over until a man makes exactly the same suggestion a few minutes later, and everybody says, "Isn't that great?" And it's always frustrating for women, because they've all had that experience. So I think women's ideas are not taken as seriously, because in the patriarchal system, women are viewed as supports, as you described earlier with the religion, for the men who are supposed to have the ideas and are supposed to be the leaders. And that means that women are viewed as having less value. And that's what we're trying to break out of right now and bring ourselves up so that we actually are viewed as being equals and that our ideas are viewed as having as much merit. And it's all of this status even comes out in things like humor. The research shows that male comedians get more laughs than female comedians.
Really?
Because humor has a status element in it. We tend to laugh at those that we think are more worthy.
So, where can people find you online?
My website is just Google my name, BettyAnnHeggie.com, and it'll come up, and there's a lot of information there. I've done a teaching model that's free where you can walk your way through. It's about 4, maybe 30-minute segments where you can learn all about gender physics and hear some of my stories. I have a shortened version of the questionnaire. The longer version of the questionnaire is available in my book, and you can take that. I have a number of, here's my book. I have a number of blogs available. I'm online I have a Facebook page, I have an Instagram page, but basically just go to my website and you'll find a lot of information. And I always tell people, look, I'm available. I get up in the morning and I get emails from people saying, what about this, what about that? And I enjoy answering them.
Good. And what do you wish that people asked you about more often?
I think I would like people to think more often about their own charisma, their own it quality, which comes from being who you are. So I just think the more conversations we can have about who we are and how we can express who we are, and that means bringing out the attributes of both genders, because we are naturally as humans attracted to balance. We like in photography faces that are balanced. If you look at things like the golden mean, it's because it's all in balance. We are attracted to balance. So we are attracted to people who are in balance. And that means that we're bringing forth who we are and we're using the attributes of both. And that's what I'd like people to talk about more. It's just that it's a little bit hard to get your head around. So I appreciate you helping me spread the message.
And looking back, what is something you wish you knew, like at the beginning of the journey? And then what is something you're glad that you didn't know?
The attributes of the masculine are to work hard, play hard. They live to work. The attributes of the feminine are to work, to live. So they tend to take more time to smell the roses and enjoy themselves along the way. And the best piece of advice that I could give myself would be take more time to work to live as opposed to just live to work. And the other part of it was.
And what is one thing you're glad that you didn't know at the beginning of your journey?
Glad that I didn't know. I'm probably glad that I didn't know that sometimes we have to learn to be more of ourselves and express that, but sometimes we can be too much. And sometimes we have to dial it up in order to dial it back. And I'm glad that I didn't know that it was going to be dangerous to dial it up, because I might have lived in fear and in a box as opposed to stepping outside and maybe been too much. But in being too much, it allowed me to be more of who I am.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that all the people that watch it enjoy it as well.